I wonder how many of you remember the old saying, don't upset the apple cart. It basically meant don't say anything negative. It was used quite a lot in my family. Isaiah just does not agree with that mantra. Even a casual glance at Isaiah 64 will make obvious to us that this is a negative chapter. I'm very wary of the word negative because I believe that expressing negative emotion can actually be a good thing. So we'll put the word negative in inverted commas. If this was a psalm, which it is, it would be called a lament psalm. He's expressing grief at what's happening. And I believe when we express our grief, it can lead to good things. I believe there's such a thing as good grief. It really is a lament psalm. Look how it begins. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down. Isaiah feels that God is shut off in heaven and he can't get hold of him. He might have used the phrase from Deuteronomy 28, the heavens are like brass. Or a more modern phrase would be, I feel that my prayers are just hitting the ceiling. The grand old South American preacher Juan Carlos Ortiz would say to that, what on earth were you doing praying to the ceiling? Do you think God's up there? Do you think God's in the sky like we wrongly teach our children? No, the mystery of the ages, that which the angels long to look into, is Christ in you. Jesus is inside me, therefore I should direct my prayers inward. There's food for thought. But even then, sometimes one just feels he's not accessible. I can't feel him, I can't find him. And that's cause to grieve. Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn. We would be taught in English to have called that an oxymoron. It's an apparent contradiction. Happy are the unhappy. But of course these words are much deeper than just happiness. And Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn. I think he meant that at different levels. Definitely he meant it literally. There's no greater comfort if you've lost a loved one or something precious than a sense of the presence of God. I have a friend who's just gone through a terrible bout with COVID. He was in intensive care for 3 weeks, on a ventilator for 10 days, and he says that ventilator just sucks everything out of you. And during those 10 dark days, he can't remember much. He just remembers some dreams, he remembers some hallucinations, but he also remembers a very real sense of the presence of God with him. When he came round, the doctor showed him his x-rays and said, with 50% of your lungs gone, it's a miracle you're alive. And I think it probably was a miracle. The presence of Christ saw him through that. Wonderful to have his presence when you're grieving, perhaps even your own death. But I think Jesus is saying more than that. I think he's saying, I want you to have an attitude of mourning that you carry with you all the time in life. This is part of the Beatitudes, which, as I said, one African-American preacher called the beautiful attitudes. I want you to have an attitude of mourning through life. So what should we be mourning about? Well, I think two things. The first is our own sinfulness. As opposed to our sins, we always taught children that lying, cheating, stealing, those are sins with an S on the end of them. But there's something within us that is sinfulness that leads us to do those things and is actually much more serious. And Isaiah here gives 3 definitions of sinfulness that within us. All 3 of them, interestingly, are things we don't do. The first is we forget that God is the potter and you are the clay. We so want to be the potter. God is the subject, we're the object. We'd love it to be the other way around. That was why the temptation was so strong for Eve, because the serpent said, the day you eat of it, you'll be like God. I so want to be master of my fate and captain of my soul. That's the essence of all sinfulness. And the second definition of sinfulness is no one strives to lay hold of him. I think Protestant Christianity has got to a very bad state where we think we can have a relationship with God without effort. Now, it's quite true. We come to Christ, we're given salvation without effort. But to think we can have a relationship with God without effort is just wrong. You actually can't have a relationship with anyone without effort. And Isaiah says the essence of sinfulness is not to be bothered to put in that effort. And there's such wonderful books on spiritual disciplines to help us put in that effort. And then the third thing we don't do is we don't gladly do what is right. Now, gladness and holiness we would think of as another oxymoron, not two words you put together. That's just a measure of how little we understand of holiness. Holiness is a great source of gladness. Glad to be free of sin, free of guilt, free of any sense of shame, to be able to be in relationship with God, in relationship with other people, in relationship with the creation. Holiness is a wonderful, positive thing. And our very attitude that we think of holiness as dour and unpleasant is the heart of sinfulness. And so I think Jesus wants us an attitude of mourning for our sinfulness. But I think there's something else he wants us to mourn for, and that is to mourn for what Satan has done to his world. We were taught as children that Jesus wept is the shortest verse in the Bible. And I've often wondered, why did Jesus weep? Yes, he wept because the sisters were weeping at the death of Lazarus, and he always weeps with those that weep. But still, he was about to raise him from the dead. He knew he was. He said he was going to. He was going to remove the need for grief, so why the grieving? And I think it was, he was grieving for what Satan had done to his world, which was never meant to be full of death and grief and mourning. And they took him up the hill to look over the beautiful new city of Jerusalem and say how beautiful it was, and all he could do was weep for all that Jerusalem could have been and never was, and all that was about to be lost in the next 40 years. Jesus weeps over his world. Jeremiah wept over the downfall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. That led to one of the great paintings of the world by Rembrandt. All of the characteristics of Rembrandt are there. The light coming down from the top left at 45 degrees. And you look at that painting and say, it's incredible. It's only paint. It's an optical illusion. There's no light there at all. And he's famous for his backgrounds, which are often dark and a bit out of focus. Look at this painting of the crucifixion. The background is quite dark. And in the middle of the background is Rembrandt in a turban in 17th century clothing, looking, as it were, at the camera, at us. And he's saying, I in the 16th century, you in the 20th century, we're all to blame for this atrocity. And look at the background of the painting of Jeremiah grieving. Just a hint of broken down buildings and of tremendous flames as it all goes up in smoke. And Jeremiah feels no satisfaction that all he predicted for so long has now come true. And Isaiah also grieves for the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 10 and 11 are among the most poignant in the Bible. Your sacred cities have become a wasteland, Jerusalem a desolation, and our holy and glorious temple where our ancestors praised you has been burned with fire, and all that we treasured lies in ruins. Isaiah grieved his beloved city. You don't grieve something you don't love. I've become very concerned over the last years at the way Christians in South Africa are responding to things that happen in South Africa. So many are responding simply by criticizing and complaining, and we become no different from those around us. I believe Jesus is calling us rather to grieve and to mourn what is happening in our country and to turn it into prayer. When grief is turned to prayer, you get good grief. And I know there are those watching these videos from other countries. You will know what you need to grieve and pray for. Isaiah 64 is a psalm. It's a prayer. It's not addressed to the people like so many other chapters here. But in all this darkness and negativity, Isaiah still keeps his faith. And he does it by thinking back on the past, and he allows the past to inform the present. And he says this, since ancient times you did awesome things, past tense. And he outlines how wonderful those things were. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no one has perceived the wonderful things you've done. That sounds familiar. Paul picked up that verse in 2 Corinthians 2 to refer to heaven, to the future and the things God has in store for us. One of the secrets of grieving is to allow the past and the future to inform the present and give us hope and faith. And Isaiah, in spite of the feeling that God is not there, keeps his faith, and he says this, you come to the help of those who gladly do right. Notice the word come in the present tense. He's trusting, and it's our job to keep our faith. We may feel that the skies are dark, that there's no light breaking through, but we must hold on to the belief and the hope that the light will break through, that the sun will shine again. And so I leave you perhaps with a little mathematical formula. Mourning plus faith plus prayer leads to good grief.